Romans chapter 3. Therefore a man is justified by faith, apart from the law. In Romans chapter 3, Paul continues his letter to the Romans by addressing some of the key differences between Jewish and Gentile believers. The chapter emphasizes that all, both Jews and Gentiles, are under the power of sin. Paul says that anyone can be justified freely by God's grace, through faith in Christ Jesus. The chapter closes with the notion that faith doesn't negate the law, but rather upholds it. Exegesis by sections and verses. Verses 1 to 8. The advantage of the Jews, and the faithfulness of God. Paul begins by discussing the advantage of being Jewish, which chiefly lies in being entrusted with the oracles of God, which are the Scriptures. Despite this, many Jews did not believe. The fact that many Jews did not believe does not invalidate God's faithfulness. In contrast, it establishes God's truthfulness, even if it makes every human a liar. However, Paul emphasizes that human unbelief does not nullify God's faithfulness. He refutes the idea that God is unjust to inflict wrath, explaining that if God were not righteous in his judgment, he could not judge the world. Paul also rejects the notion that doing evil could bring about good, asserting that such a belief deserves condemnation. Verses 9 to 20. Everyone has sinned. Paul concludes that both Jews and Gentiles are under the power of sin. He references a series of Old Testament passages to underline human sinfulness, emphasizing that no one can be justified by works of the law. Verses 21 to 26. Justification is only through faith. Paul emphasizes the fact that righteousness can only be experienced through faith in Jesus Christ, which is available to anyone and everyone who believes. He declares that Christ's sacrifice was the propitiation for man's sin. Christ's sacrifice on the cross satisfied God's anger of every man's sin, which exhibits God's righteousness and justice. Verses 27 to 31. Faith makes man's boasting impossible, but it upholds the law. Paul states that man's boasting is not possible, because justification comes from faith, and not by keeping the law. He confirms that God is the God of both Jews and Gentiles, and that faith doesn't undermine the law, but rather upholds it. Overall summary. Romans chapter 3 presents a comprehensive discussion on sin, law, faith, and righteousness. Paul addresses the Jews' advantages due to their heritage, but underscores the truth that both Jews and Gentiles are sinners. He declares the life-changing doctrine of justification by faith in Christ, emphasizing that righteousness does not come from the law, but through faith in Jesus. The chapter ends with Paul affirming that faith upholds the law, and that God is the God of all, both Jews and Gentiles.